When a battered Allied heavy bomber limped back to base after a disastrous mission over occupied Europe, no one on the ground was prepared for what they were about to see. The aircraft looked as if it had flown through an invisible storm of explosives. Entire panels were peeled back, oxygen lines torn apart, fuel tanks ruptured in unnatural shapes, and control cables sliced with eerie uniformity. Mechanics and intelligence officers swarmed around the damaged airframe, exchanging baffled looks. They were accustomed to reading battle damage like doctors read X-rays, but this time nothing added up. The holes riddling the bomber were far too violent to have been made by standard rifle-caliber machine guns, yet the pattern was too tightly grouped and too rapid for a 20mm cannon. Even more unsettling, the internal blast damage suggested that small explosive charges had detonated on the bomber's skin, shredding aluminum as if it were cloth. Crew members who survived swore they had been hit by something new, describing small flashes and instant fire erupting from single impacts. The reports were confused, but consistent enough to raise alarms. For months, Allied analysts had assumed their losses were due to bad luck, improved enemy aim, or secondary explosions inside the bombers. But this aircraft told a different story. The damage was too precise, like a signature. Something small, something fast, something highly explosive. The analysts were staring at evidence of a weapon that didn't fit any category they knew. This mystery arrived at a critical moment. Enemy defenses were tightening, and daylight raids were becoming increasingly dangerous. Yet this bomber's wounds pointed to an alarming truth. The enemy had introduced a weapon capable of tearing apart heavy aircraft with terrifying efficiency, and doing so from a distance. As investigators mapped each damaged panel and sifted through fragmented metal, they noticed thin, distorted bits of steel embedded in the fuselage. These weren't from Allied rounds. They weren't from known enemy calibers either. The recovered fragments were shockingly light, almost delicate, and strangely thin-walled, unlike any machine gun projectile in Allied inventories. The realization struck with chilling force. The enemy had created a hybrid, a small-caliber round that behaved like a miniature high-explosive shell. Intelligence officers immediately understood the implications. Heavy bombers, built to absorb dozens of hits from conventional weapons, were now vulnerable to a much smaller gun firing at an astonishing rate. Whatever this new system was, it threatened the entire Allied bombing strategy. It was the beginning of a new chapter in aerial warfare, one written not with bigger cannons or heavier rounds, but with a deceptively compact weapon that delivered destruction far beyond its size. What Allied analysts eventually uncovered was not a new cannon, not a larger caliber weapon, and not some experimental airframe-mounted explosive. Instead, it was something far more surprising, a compact heavy machine gun that looked unremarkable yet produced catastrophic damage far out of proportion to its size. The enemy had quietly introduced a 13mm weapon engineered with a single purpose: to dismantle heavy bombers without slowing down the fighters that carried it. Unlike bulky 20mm cannons that required reinforced mounts, complex recoil systems, and aerodynamically disastrous underwing pods, this small gun fit neatly inside a fighter's tightly packed nose cowling. It didn't compromise speed, climb rate, or maneuverability, the qualities enemy pilots desperately needed to survive increasingly deadly Allied escorts. What made this gun truly terrifying, however, was not its size. It was the ammunition. The engineers behind it had asked a radical question. What if a round didn't need thick steel walls for penetration? What if it sacrificed strength for explosive payload instead? That idea produced the thin-shell explosive round, a projectile built with walls so slender that almost all internal space could be filled with high-yield explosive. Once fired at high velocity, these shells behaved unlike anything Allied crews were prepared for. They didn't burrow into the aircraft. They detonated the instant they touched aluminum skin. Instead of a neat hole, one impact could tear a ragged crater. Instead of a minor leak, a single hit could rupture a fuel tank wide open. Instead of a flicker, fires erupted instantly, violent, hungry flames that spread faster than crewmen could react. Even oxygen systems, normally resilient to small arms fire, detonated in bursts of white-hot flashes when struck. And this wasn't a slow, cannon-like rate of fire delivering single, spaced explosions. The 13mm gun spat nearly 1,000 rounds per minute. In the span of 2 seconds, a bomber could be struck by 20 or 30 mini-explosives, each acting like a tiny surface mine. It created a horrifying combination: machine gun speed with the punch of a microcannon. Enemy pilots quickly adapted their tactics. They no longer needed long approach windows or perfect aim. A high-speed pass from above or the rear quarter, barely a couple of seconds exposed to defensive fire, was enough to cripple a massive 4-engine aircraft. A single burst could collapse control surfaces, puncture coolant lines, ignite fuel cells, or snap hydraulic controls. To the pilots firing these weapons, it felt like finally having a tool built for the modern air war. To the crews flying through their volleys, it felt like facing a new kind of terror, invisible until the moment explosions blossomed across their wings. The enemy had finally found the balance they had been chasing for years. A lightweight, high-rate, explosive weapon that didn't slow the fighter down, but devastated anything it touched. Once the new 13mm explosive weapon entered regular frontline service, everything about the air war began to shift. Before its arrival, enemy fighter pilots attacking Allied bomber formations depended on nerve-shaking precision. They had to dive close, sometimes within 100 meters, hold a steady line under heavy defensive fire, and pump enough cannon shells or rifle-caliber rounds into a single point to cause meaningful structural damage. It was a deadly dance that cost many pilots their lives. But with the advent of this lightweight, high-rate explosive gun, those days ended almost overnight. Enemy pilots quickly realized they no longer needed to risk prolonged, close-in attacks. Lightning-fast passes became the new standard, dangerous but far less suicidal than before. Fighters would drop out of the sun or approach from the blind rear quarter, unleash a 1 or 2 second burst, then peel away before turret gunners could even align their sights. To them, it felt as if they had been handed a scalpel made of fire. The weapon's high rate of fire allowed pilots to saturate a bomber's wing or fuselage with dozens of explosive impacts in moments. But it was the nature of the projectile detonating on contact that made the difference. Crews reported seeing entire sections of their aircraft erupt into sparks and flame without warning. Flak gunners described bright flashes along their wings, followed by the horrifying sensation of controls going slack or engines coughing into silence. This wasn't the typical pattern of damage they were trained to expect. It was more violent, more sudden, and far more crippling. The effect on formations was devastating. A bomber knocked out of alignment became an easy target. Fires forced aircraft to fall out of the protective combat box, where they were quickly swarmed. Even small hits could disable vital systems that normally required heavy cannon fire. Tail control rods snapped, oil coolers ruptured, gun turrets jammed, and oxygen supply lines burst open in jets of flame. The new weapon brought with it a psychological blow that intelligence officers had underestimated. Air crews had always steeled themselves for the slow, pounding impacts of cannons or the harmless tapping of rifle ball rounds. But they were unprepared for explosions erupting from bullets barely larger than their own .50 caliber ammunition. For many gunners, it felt impossible. How could something so small strike with the force of a miniature bomb? Missions that once felt survivable suddenly became gauntlets of shock and fire. The mood in briefing rooms changed. Veterans grew silent. Even rookie crews sensed the shift. They were going up against something new, something they had no manual or training for. Behind enemy lines, commanders noted the results with grim satisfaction. Their fighters could now carry more firepower without the penalty of heavy gun pods. Their pilots could attack faster, disengage sooner, and live longer. The air war's balance was beginning to tilt in a direction no one had predicted. Not through larger cannons or heavier rounds, but through a deceptively compact weapon engineered for maximum destructive effect. As losses mounted and the same strange pattern of damage kept appearing on returning bombers, Allied command was forced to abandon earlier assumptions. This was no fluke, no coincidence, and certainly no result of improved enemy aim. Something new was carving open aircraft that were designed to survive dozens of conventional hits, and it was doing so with terrifying ease. The breakthrough finally came from a series of painstaking investigations. Ground crews and ordnance specialists collected mangled pieces of metal from damaged aircraft, searching for anything that might reveal the origin of this unfamiliar destruction. Among the twisted fragments of aluminum and ruptured fuel tanks, they found what they were looking for: thin, brittle shards of steel that did not match the robustness of standard enemy rounds. These fragments were unmistakable. They were part of a new kind of projectile, one that had never appeared in Allied manuals or intelligence reports. When analysts examined these thin-walled casings, their shock turned into concern. The shells were almost hollow compared to typical machine gun ammunition. Instead of a thick jacket for structural strength, the interior was packed with high explosive. It became clear that the damage patterns were not the result of deep penetration, as with cannons, but immediate surface detonation. The weapon functioned more like a rapid-fire delivery system for miniature explosive charges. Once this truth was confirmed, reports rushed upward through command channels. The Allies finally understood why so many aircraft were falling out of formation in sudden bursts of flame. They were not facing typical machine gun fire. They were facing thousands of micro-explosions delivered in seconds. This discovery forced an urgent reassessment of bomber vulnerability. Engineers scrambled to develop practical countermeasures. Adding armor everywhere was impossible. The aircraft were already operating at their structural limits. Instead, they focused on reinforcing critical spots: oil coolers, oxygen lines, and turret housings that were disproportionately affected by these contact-detonating rounds. Operational doctrine shifted as well. Crews were instructed to tighten formations even more than before, creating overlapping barriers of defensive fire that might disrupt enemy attack runs. The combat box, once merely a defensive tactic, became a lifeline. If a bomber slipped out, even for a moment, it could be isolated and destroyed in seconds. Despite these adjustments, morale inevitably took a hit. Airmen could accept being fired upon by cannons, flak, or fighters. These were threats they knew. But the idea of small-caliber rounds exploding on contact shook even experienced crews. Many described feeling as though they were being struck by invisible grenades. Others reported hearing thin metal pop and twist in ways they had never encountered before. In briefing rooms across England and Italy, officers emphasized discipline, vigilance, and formation integrity. But whispers spread quickly among crews. The enemy had found something new, something unervingly efficient. The air war, once a contest of endurance and numbers, now felt like a battle against an unseen explosive rain that could tear open a bomber without warning. The Allies had uncovered the secret, but they still had no easy answer to it. By late 1943 and into the early months of 1944, the enemy's new 13mm explosive weapon had become a central part of their defensive strategy. Fighter units flying both nimble interceptors and heavier twin-engine night fighters relied on it to inflict maximum damage in minimum time. For a brief but brutal window, the weapon changed the momentum of the air war. It allowed shrinking enemy air fleets to punch far above their weight, delivering crippling losses to Allied bombers despite dwindling pilot numbers and limited fuel reserves. Every successful interception followed a pattern. Fighters dove from above, using gravity to boost speed and minimize exposure. As they closed in, pilots aimed not for armored cockpits or thick central fuselage sections, but for the aircraft's weak points: the wings, the engine nacelles, the oil radiators, the narrow control linkages that kept the bomber steady in the air. A 1-second burst scattered dozens of explosive impacts across these vulnerable areas, each one erupting into a flurry of shrapnel and fire. Even without a catastrophic hit, the bomber's internal systems often began to fail. Oil pressure dropped, turrets froze, ailerons jammed. Flames crawled along fuel tank seams. Many aircraft that survived the initial pass became easy prey. Falling out of formation meant forfeiting the protective ring of interlocking guns that kept enemy fighters at bay. Once isolated, a bomber could be shredded in seconds. It was during this period that some of the most severe Allied losses occurred. Entire groups were decimated over key industrial targets, forcing temporary suspensions of deep penetration raids. Yet even as the enemy weapon reached its peak effectiveness, larger forces were already shifting the strategic balance. The Allies introduced long-range escort fighters, aircraft that could accompany bombers all the way to their targets and back. These escorts, fast and heavily armed, began tearing into the enemy fighter force long before it could organize effective attack runs. Suddenly, the defensive fighters weren't choosing when or where to strike. They were fighting for survival. The hit-and-run tactics that the explosive 13mm weapon relied on became harder to execute. Before a pilot could line up a clean pass, escorts appeared, forcing evasive actions and breaking up coordinated attacks. Even when a fighter managed to reach the bomber stream, the time available to aim and fire dwindled rapidly. Fuel shortages and a collapsing industrial base compounded the problem. Experienced pilots, the ones who knew how to exploit the weapon's strengths, were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Newer pilots struggled to replicate the precision and timing required for successful high-speed passes. The weapon remained lethal, but fewer pilots survived long enough to use it effectively. By early 1945, the skies over Europe were no longer dominated by interceptors darting in with explosive volleys. Instead, they were filled with swarms of Allied escorts, overwhelming numbers that no lightweight weapon could counter. The compact 13mm gun had been brilliantly engineered, devastatingly effective, and perfectly suited to its moment. But even its explosive power could not halt the relentless advance of overwhelming Allied air superiority. Its peak had passed, overshadowed not by better weapons, but by sheer numbers, fuel reserves, and the strategic depth of the forces opposing it. When the war finally tilted irreversibly out of the enemy's reach, their once fearsome air fleet dwindled into scattered pockets of resistance. The lightweight 13mm explosive weapon, which had once terrified bomber crews and reshaped aerial tactics, remained in service until the very end, but now as a remnant of an era slipping away. Its effectiveness was never in question. Its problem was that it had been born into a war the enemy could no longer sustain. Factories were bombed, veteran pilots were gone, and fuel grew scarce. Even the most brilliantly engineered weapons are powerless without the infrastructure to keep them operational. The compact explosive gun, with all its mechanical reliability and destructive punch, simply couldn't compensate for the collapse happening on the ground. Interceptors that once dove confidently into bomber streams were now forced into desperate defensive scrambles, often intercepted before they could even see the formation they were meant to destroy. Yet despite its decline, the weapon left a legacy that extended far beyond the conflict. After the war, Allied engineers extensively studied captured examples, along with the thin-walled explosive rounds that caused so much devastation. What they found reshaped post-war aerial ammunition design. Engineers realized that a high-explosive charge in a small, thin-jacketed shell could inflict remarkable damage on aluminum aircraft structures, often more efficiently than heavier armor-piercing rounds. The idea influenced the development of post-war 20 to 30mm cannon shells, many of which adopted a similar emphasis on maximizing internal explosive filler at the cost of heavier casing walls. For historians, the weapon became a symbol of desperate wartime innovation. Not the biggest or most glamorous armament, but a perfect marriage of engineering necessity and battlefield need. It represented a philosophy that prioritized efficiency over brute force, deliver the maximum destructive effect in the smallest, fastest package possible. For surviving bomber crews, its memory remained vivid. Veterans spoke of sudden blossoms of fire on their wings, of metallic popping sounds unlike anything they had heard before, of shrapnel that sliced through compartments with unnatural ferocity. They recalled the way a single short burst could transform a functioning aircraft into a crippled machine fighting gravity and flame. The weapon had earned their respect and their fear in ways few other guns ever had. In hindsight, the explosive 13mm weapon did exactly what its designers intended. It allowed small fighters to seriously threaten large bombers without sacrificing speed or agility. It bought the enemy Air Force time, painful, costly months during which daylight bombing became a perilous gamble. But it also revealed a truth that shaped the rest of the air war. Even the most innovative weapons cannot overcome overwhelming industrial might, strategic depth, and numerical superiority. When the tide turned, it turned with a force no machine gun could push back. Still, its legacy endures. The tiny weapon with thin-walled ammunition proved that innovation is not always about making something bigger. Sometimes the deadliest ideas come from making something smaller and far more efficient than anyone thought possible. It remains an unforgettable chapter in aerial warfare, the story of how a deceptively modest weapon carved its name into history with explosions far larger than its size.